Hi, good morning. So today's lecture is about change, and things are going to change today. Our relationship is going to change today. So stay tuned. Last time we ended by talking about the different kinds of change. The first approach, the gradual approach, like water wearing down stone, chipping away gradually, slowly, taking our time. The second approach, the acute change, the sledgehammer breaking stone, creating a new pathway, new channel. And the important thing to keep in mind with both forms of changes, with all form of change, lasting change that is, which is what we're about, not just the spike and the return to base level. The thing to keep in mind about change is that neither is quick fix. Even when we pick up that sledgehammer, even when we pick it up, we need to do a lot of work before the preparation. So for example, gradual change, slow change would be doing the gratitude exercise every day. Slowly becoming more and more of a benefit finder. Gradually looking more at the positive. Creating a new neural pathway, neuron by neuron. Remember, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, two very important concepts, because just by knowing, by understanding that our brain changes, that in and of itself makes us more likely to change. And this is work done by Carol Dweck, whom I'll discuss in future courses when we discuss perfectionism. And then the sledgehammer example is like the eureka experience, the great insight that doesn't come in a vacuum. It comes after a lot of hard work, after a lot of preparation. You know, the 99% perspiration that leads to that inspiration. So no quick fix. And the belief in quick fix, the expectation of a quick fix, that is one of the reasons why levels of depression are so high today. Because people are frustrated, they're disappointed, they think that there is something wrong with them when they don't succeed in the quick fix, but I just read in a book that it's possible that if I do these 5 things, I'll be happy for the rest of my life. And I do these 5 things, and I'm not happier. And then I begin to question myself. No quick fix. It takes time. No 5 easy steps to happiness. Before we go into the change process, there are a few things we need to understand. The first thing to understand is this. Do you really want to change? Do I really want to improve certain things in my personality, things that, or character, or behavior, things that I don't like? And it's not a trivial question. It is not a rhetorical question. Because very often on the conscious level we may be saying yes, but on the subconscious level something is stopping us. Let me show you an example. So this is a study done by Langer and Thompson back in the 80s. And here is what they did. They brought students in, or participants in, and they asked them whether they wanted to get rid of a certain characteristic, like rigidity, or being gullible, or grimness. And they asked them whether they wanted to get rid of these characteristics and whether they succeeded in becoming better in this area. Were you able to introduce change? So were you able to actually become less rigid, if this was important for you to change, or less gullible, or less grim? So this is the first 2 questions that they asked. Did you want to improve on it? Did you want to change this? And the second question, were you successful? And then after they answered these questions, there was a second part to this study, where they asked them to evaluate the following positive characteristics. Consistency. Is it important to you? Is it important to you to be trustworthy? And how important it is for you to be and to be perceived as a serious person. Now here is the interesting finding in this research. Those individuals who rated the positive traits, the ones in yellow, who rated them high as personally important to them, we're less likely to change the negatives. Do you understand the implications of this study? So what it's saying is that, let's say I do want to get rid of rigidity. I don't like being rigid. However, at the same time, consistency is a very important value to me. I'm less likely to change my rigidity because they're associated in my mind. And yeah, I don't want to be rigid, but at the same time, subconscious talking here, I want to be consistent. Don't let go of this rigidity because I couple them, I associate them together. Not wanting to get rid of one because I don't want the baby out with the bathwater. And to me, they're linked. The same with gullibility and trustworthiness. We can say that the other side of gullibility is someone who is trustworthy. Now, going to the extreme, I become gullible. However, I don't get rid of my gullibility because I don't want to also get rid of my trustworthiness. Same with grim. I may be grim, but that's also subconsciously a sign of my seriousness. For years, literally years, when I've been thinking and writing and analyzing the notion of perfectionism, I couldn't understand why it didn't get better for a very long time. Because I knew perfectionism was hurting me. I read the research and I looked through personal experiences. I knew that it was hurting me in terms of my well-being for sure, but also in the long term in terms of my success. And yet I couldn't get rid of perfectionism until I read the study. And I asked myself, okay, so what's the counterpart to perfectionism? What's tied in my mind? What goes hand in hand for me with perfectionism? What goes hand in hand is drive and ambition. Now, if I had to define myself, this is one of the first things that I would define myself as. I'm driven and I'm ambitious. And because I didn't want to lose these characteristics, my subconscious didn't let me, stopped me from getting rid of the perfectionism. Perfectionism, which I define as a debilitating fear of failure. A failure that prevents us, and we'll have a whole week on perfectionism, so we'll get more in depth. You'll understand what it means. And it was only once I understood that for me these two things go hand in hand, I was able to unpack them, to distinguish them, and said, I want to keep one, not the other. Or, for example, worry and anxiety. Again, I've mentioned this many times before. Next time I'll talk to you about the process that I underwent to overcome anxiety. Part of me, since the time I can remember myself, being anxious, whether it's before matches in squash, whether it's before exams, whether it's before speaking up in section when I was an undergrad. And I wanted to stop that. I didn't want that. However, I didn't let go of worry and anxiety because I also saw it with responsibility. Well, if I'm anxious, it means I'm responsible, so I prepare for class much more as opposed to just let go and become a slacker. So I associated a positive trait, which is responsibility. Again, remember Brandon, no one is coming. Very important trait, responsibility. But that prevented me from letting go, subconscious level, not conscious, of the worry and anxiety that I often experienced. Guilt. Again, there's good guilt, there's bad guilt. It is. Well, I don't want to get rid of guilt because would that mean I'm not being empathic and sensitive toward other people? Very often, we connect the two. They go hand in hand. Another couple is the notion of simplifying. This is something very personal to me. I wanted to do less because I knew that taking on too many activities was actually hurting me, was hurting my productivity, creativity, well-being. I couldn't simplify. Why? Because I associated in my mind with losing my edge. So I didn't let go. Or fault-finding. We talked about this a week ago. Why do people not let go of fault-finding? Why do they remain pessimistic? Because they connect it with a sense of realism. I don't want to stop being realistic. I don't want to be one of those detached Pollyannas, and therefore I don't let go of my fault-finding. Happiness. One of the most significant barriers to people's happiness is that they associate happiness with slacking off. Because the dominant paradigm, the dominant mantra in our culture today is no pain, no gain. And if I'm happy now, i.e. not experiencing pain, it means I'm letting go. It means I'm not going to be successful. It means I'm going to lose my edge. It means I'm going to lose my drive and ambition. So our subconscious prefers to keeps us unhappy so that we don't lose the other things that we value highly. Things such as ambition, things such as having an edge, things such as our hard work. Now, of course, when we look at them, we know that they don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. On the contrary, for example, happiness, we know from the broaden and build theory that positive emotions are actually associated with higher levels of success. Or as I'll talk about after spring break when we talk about perfectionism, we know from research, you'll be able to connect it also in the person, many of you will be able to connect on the personal level. We know that letting go of this fear of failure and coping, putting ourselves on the line more, learning from failures, looking at it as a stepping stone, that contributes to our success in the long term. It doesn't need to take away from our drive and ambition. On the contrary. And the key, if we want to overcome this fear of failure, or the worry and anxiety, or the guilt, or this lack of happiness, is very often, not always, very often about understanding or gaining a better understanding of these characteristics. For example, understanding that I want to let go of my fear of failure, the debilitating fear of failure, not just fear of failure, because everyone is afraid of failing to some extent. But to let go of the debilitating fear of failure and yet maintain my drive and ambition. So a more nuanced understanding. They don't need to go hand in hand. Or I never used to be able to say no to people. Such a short word, such an easy word, so difficult at times to say. Why? Because I see myself and I want other people to see me as empathic, as sensitive, as a nice guy. But then I unpacked the two. And I realized it doesn't have to go hand in. I can say no to people very sensitively. Because very often when I say yes to others, I'm saying no to myself. And in the long term, very often to the relationship. So now I have a better, more nuanced understanding of when I can say no and when I don't want to say no, while maintaining my sensitivity and my empathy, without experiencing the same levels of guilt that I experienced before whenever I said no. And the same you can do for every one of these characteristics. So think about, what if you wanted to change for a very long time and weren't successful in? Was it perfectionism? Was it, this very serious grimness and you wanted to be more playful? Well, maybe you didn't want to get rid of it because you were afraid of losing your seriousness. And you don't need to. The baby can stay, the bathwater can go, if we have a more nuanced understanding of what it is we want to change. In section next week, you're going to do an exercise with your teaching fellows called sentence completion. In that exercise, this is exactly what you're going to do. You're going to identify, it's an exercise devised by Nathaniel Brandon. You're going to do an exercise that will help you identify what you want to get rid of and what you want to keep. And very often that switch that you make in your mind, subconscious as well as conscious mind, can open the floodwaters, the gates to a new channel, new pathway in our brain, real lasting change. We're going to discuss 3 distinct, though interconnected pathways to change. The ABCs of psychology, which we've mentioned before. The ABCs, the A is the affect, the emotion. The B is the behavior, the action. And C is the cognition, the thought. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about each one of the 3. And for each one, we're going to talk about the gradual change approach and the acute change approach. So in a sense, we're building a 3x2. Affect, behavior, cognition times gradual and acute. And we're going to talk about 6 different approaches to change. These 6 approaches to change are interconnected. It's important to connect them. And ideally, we want all three. Why? Quote that I've used a few times and will use again. John Dryden, British poet. We first make our habits, and then our habits make us. In order to change habit, in order to bring about lasting change, we need to have as much of a solid approach, as much force in the intervention. It's not just enough to focus on emotions, not just enough to focus on action. It's not enough just to focus on our thinking. We want to focus on the three, the A, the B, and the C. Think about it. It's like habit can be looked at as a flood. There is a flood in our mind of certain neurons firing in a certain neural pathway. And what we want to do is to overcome this flood. And to overcome this flood, we need as much force as we can. Therefore, we want to use as many approaches as we can. Before we jump into the A, one more thing. What do we want to change? What can we change? And what can we not change? So according to researchers led by the likes of Sonia Lyubomirsky, Ed Diner, happiness comprises, or to explain an individual's happiness, we need to look at three factors. The first factor is the genetic set range. It's not a genetic set point, it's a range. We're all born with certain predisposition toward happiness and well-being. Some people are born with, the smiley face, with the smiley spoon in their mouth. Others, less so. And we're all somewhere on this, bell curve. Some people luckier than others. As I've mentioned a couple of times before, I wasn't born that lucky. I was born more on the anxious side of this curve, not with the happiness spoon in my mouth. Which, by the way, I think helps me teach this class. Because I do these things, I apply these things, I make a difference in my life. Been there, done that, doing it. I can speak from personal experiences, as you know. Now, some people may look at it and say, that's terrible that we have a genetic set range. Well, my answer to that is, it's not good, it's not bad. It is. The law of gravity is not good, it's not bad. It is. And nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. We need to look at our nature, understand it, and then make the best of it. About 50% of our levels of well-being, of the variance in explaining happiness, can be accounted for by genes. Which explains some of the results of, for example, the twin studies, why there were such similarities among the twins, even if they were, or between the twins, even if they were reared apart. Because genes matter. Not good, not bad, it is. They matter. 50%, not 100%, thank God, but 50% of the variance. The important thing to keep in mind is that we have a lot of control what we do with these genes. One could argue that success, and I'm just throwing out numbers, I don't know what it is exactly, but success of basketball players is determined 50% by genes in terms of how much fast twitch versus slow twitch they have in their muscles, how high they can jump, how coordinated they are, how tall they are. All these things matter. They go into and these are determined by genes. However, if Michael Jordan hadn't worked on his basketball, I would be a better player than he is. If he didn't work on his basketball at all. And I did and do. In other words, also with genes, people who don't work on their happiness, even if they have the best of genes, will not do as well as people with less happy genes who work on it. So work matters a great deal. The second thing that matters, that makes up the 100% of variance of happiness, external circumstances. Of course, extreme circumstances make a lot of difference, whether we're living in a free country versus oppression. That makes a lot of difference. However, in general, external circumstances beyond the extremes, beyond being homeless on the street, make very little difference. In fact, about 10% of the total variance. So, genes, 50%, external circumstances such as place of residence, such as income, such as weather. And again, not for people, for example, who have seasonal affective disorder. Then of course it matters whether we get sun or not. But I'm talking about most people, not people with SAD. So, out of these extremes, the external circumstances matter about 10%. Not much. The third thing, the rest of the 40%, is accounted for by intentional activities. What that means is what we do, how we act, what we think about, how we interpret the world, what we focus on. In essence, what 1504 is about. What we've discussed since the first class, what we're going to discuss even more in the second half of the semester. These intentional activities are focused, these are essentially our ABCs. This is where real, meaningful change comes. And this is where we're going to focus. Would be nice if we could do something with our genes. Would be nice. Cannot. Would be nice if we had more control of our external circumstances. But even if we did, and many people do, many people sitting in this room or watching at home do have more control, doesn't make that much of a difference. What makes the most difference that we have control over are the intentional activities, our interpretation of the world and our action. So let's jump into it. The A, affect, emotion, the heart. There's a connection between, an etymological connection, linguistic connection between emotion, motivation, motion. Emotion, to move away. Without emotion, we wouldn't move. You've read about it in the book, or you will read about it in the book, about Eliot, the person who Damasio researched, who just lost his emotional faculty, and with it lost all motivation to act or do anything, even though his cognition was in place. We need emotion in order to move. So I want to talk about, again, two aspects within emotion. The first, gradual change. The second, more acute change. The gradual change is mindful meditation. Mindful meditation is arguably the most powerful intervention for bringing about calm and equanimity. A lot of research on it. We're going to spend a whole week talking about it. Today what I want to do is just introduce it, the basic, the foundation of the spiral of mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn, who in many ways is responsible for bringing serious research into this realm, he, along with people like Tara Bennett-Goldman, people like Herbert Benson from the medical school here, brought serious research to this, what was considered a mystical field. Cultivating mindfulness can lead to the discovery of deep realms of relaxation, calmness, and insight within yourself. The path to it in any moment lies no further than your own body and mind and your own breathing. This is the amazing thing about mindfulness. The results that you'll see that I'll talk about when we talk about research, quite literally mind-boggling. I mean, they change the way our mind works, transform our brain. Just by focusing on the breath, by focusing on parts of our body, by being present. All of us have the capacity to be mindful. All it involves is cultivating our ability to pay attention in the present moment. Let's experience it just for a minute or two. So here's what I'd like you to do. Once again, if you feel comfortable with it. So sit back on your chair with your back against the backrest. Make yourself as comfortable as you can. Plant both feet on the ground comfortably. And if you feel comfortable, just close your eyes. And move your attention to your breathing. Take a deep breath in, into your belly. And slow, quiet, gentle exhalation. Deep, slow inhalation all the way into your belly. Slow, gentle, quiet, long exhalation. If your mind wanders, Just return to your breathing. Now, in your mind's eye, just scan your body, your forehead, your eyes, your nose, mouth, your neck, your chest, your upper back, lower back, your legs, all the way down to your feet. Just scan your body while continuing to breathe deeply, slowly, and gently. And through your scan, find a part of your body that is a little bit more tense than the others. It could be your jaws. It could be your neck. It could be your shoulders, your stomach, where you're feeling a little bit of disease. It could be your legs, your knees, your feet. Identify that one part of the body that is a little bit more tense than the others, and focus on it, and continue to breathe. Take a deep breath into that part of your body, and when you let go, when you exhale, also let go of the tension that's there. Just relax it. And take a few deep breaths into that part of your body and relax it and let go. Return your focus to your breathing. Take a deep breath in, and slow, gentle, quiet, long exhale, relaxing with the exhalation. Deep breathing in, deep, slow, gentle, long exhaling. And at the end of the next exhalation, gently, slowly, quietly, open your eyes. Once again, if the person next to you is asleep, just gently wake them up. Tara Bennett Goldman. If someone is speaking in their sleep, please wake them up. Tara Bennett Goldman, in her book Emotional Alchemy. Mindfulness means seeing things as they are, without trying to change them. The point is to dissolve our reactions to disturbing emotions, being careful not to reject the emotion itself. This is what permission to be human is all about. Allowing the emotion, experiencing the emotion, and just breathing through it. And very often when we do that, not always, but very often, it dissolves. And with it, with the emotional dissolution of the emotion, comes also the psychological dissolution of this painful emotion. Again, we'll talk much more about this very important intervention after spring break. This is about gradual change. What we'll see when we talk about research is that even if this is gradual change, within as little as 8 weeks of regular meditation, our brain actually starts to change its form, to transform. Our immune system strengthens after as little as 8 weeks of regular daily meditation. And it doesn't have to be 5 hours a day, as little as 30 minutes or 20 minutes a day can already affect change. This is gradual, slow. Hopefully something that you will take up as a lifelong intervention. Here is an example of more acute change when it comes to our emotion. So when I thought about filling in this box in the 3x2 model, how do I find an acute emotional change? Immediately my mind went to research in clinical psychology, specifically to post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, something that has been studied, thousands and thousands of articles, research done in our department too. And when I looked at it, I said, well, this is an example of an acute change, a very acute change, because what happens when we have a trauma, many people after the trauma are changed forever, for the rest of their lives, if they have PTSD. It actually changes the chemicals that flow through our brain. It changes the structure of our brain, creates new neural pathways, kills a lot of old neural pathways as a result of a single experience. It's a sledgehammer. It is very widespread, unfortunately. I mentioned it last time. 30% of Vietnam vets have PTSD. 30%. 8% from the first Gulf War have PTSD. As I mentioned, we don't have the exact data yet from the second Gulf War, but the numbers are likely going to be higher than that. After 9/11, or before 9/11 rather, there were 20,000 individuals with PTSD south of 110th Street, New York. Right after 9/11, 60,000 individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now this has consequences. Again, it has consequences on the way our brain functions very often, not always, but very often for the rest of our lives. So this is an acute change. It comes immediately, one trauma, 9/11, or seeing something terrible in war. And then that often has an effect for the rest of for the entire life. It's a shock treatment, a negative shock treatment. Now when I look at PTSD, and when I thought about it, I asked, okay, so what does positive psychology have to do with this? I mean, this is clinical psychology. This is quote-unquote negative psychology. Well, the answer is a lot. First of all, a lot of research starting only in 1998, again, 10 years ago, the time when positive psychology came onto the scene. Research on post-traumatic growth. And what was found was that, in fact, more people experience growth as a result of a trauma than PTSD. However, we don't talk about post-traumatic growth. Everyone knows about PTSD. But again, this is another example of where the light is not shed on something that is actually working well. And what is working here? Most people are extremely resilient, able to withstand trauma. And that is a very empowering understanding to have. It will become more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and more people will experience post-traumatic growth if they only knew that it was a possibility, that it was common. If they didn't feel guilty about experiencing growth as a result of trauma. How can I grow after what I saw, what I experienced in Vietnam. It's wrong. Again, things don't happen for the best, but some people are able to make the best of things that happen. Post-traumatic growth. It happens when people begin to focus on the benefit. So what is the benefit of this trauma? It didn't happen for the best, but what have I learned from my cancer, for example? Well, to be closer to my family, to appreciate a breath, to appreciate the flowers, to enjoy my friends more. Didn't happen for the best, but I did make the best of it, benefit finding. Or many people who are able to find meaning in it through journaling, and we'll talk about journaling next class. Or people who are able to share their experiences of the trauma. Remember the difference between Holocaust survivors and Vietnam vets. Holocaust survivors shared, talked about it, wrote about it. Vietnam vets ruminated about it. Going back to the Lyubomirsky study. And when you just ruminate without sharing, without taking it out, it becomes stronger, and then it's more likely to become PTSD. But it doesn't always do that. And it's important to understand the mechanism of post-traumatic growth. So here is the question that I had. This is a positive psychology course. Remember what positive psychology is that it focuses on what works. So the question that I asked myself as I was preparing for this course was this. Is there a positive equivalent to trauma? Something that is so powerful, yet positive, that will change the way our brain functions in an instance. Like a sledgehammer. Is there something like that? Or in other words, what I asked is, can a single positive experience create a positive channel that will lead to a permanent increase in well-being, calm, and positive memories? In other words, the opposite of PTSD. And again, ask and you shall receive. A question begins a quest. And as soon as I asked this question, it opened up channels that I didn't see before, that were literally right in front of my eyes. And this was the work that I've studied for many years of one of my intellectual heroes, Abraham Maslow, who talks about the peak experience. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is more hypothesis than well-grounded research. It's a hypothesis that I hope some of you will research either here as senior thesis or in the future. We'll encourage people to research these ideas. Everything that I share in this class is based on very rigorous research. This is one area where it's a hypothesis. But bear with me and see what you think of it, of this hypothesis, when I finish explaining it. Because there is some research on it, not enough, for a stamp of approval yet. But think about it. Does it make sense? So let's see, what is a peak experience? Maslow's definition of a peak experience, it's a generalization for the best moments of the human being, for the happiest moments of life, for experiences of ecstasy, rapture, bliss, of the greatest joy. I found that such experiences came from profound aesthetic experiences, such as creative ecstasies, moments of mature love, perfect sexual experiences, parental love, experiences of natural childbirth, and many others. Everyone, or most people, have experienced peak experiences. Again, whether it was with your girlfriend, boyfriend, whether it was reading a book, whether it was listening to your favorite piece of music. Just being one with the experience. It's what many theologians talk about as the religious experience, a spiritual experience, where you just walked through the yard and suddenly felt one with John Harvard. Well, maybe not. But experience just one with everything. This is the experience that they talk about in Zen, being connected to the present. Feeling so good, so complete, like you don't need anything else. Everything is right here. I know I experienced it with my family at times. Last night, having dinner with my family and friends, we were sitting around and I just felt, this is it. What else do I need? Just being so complete, so in the moment. A peak experience. Now, these peak experiences usually don't last for very long. They come and they go. It's a peak. However, they can, and often do, have repercussions. Now, maybe you can see now where I'm going with this. So what I thought about when I thought about peak experiences was maybe, just maybe, this is the positive equivalent to the trauma. Maybe it's a shock treatment of ecstasy that can have effects beyond just the experience itself, just like PTSD has effects beyond the experience itself. There are people today who are living and reliving 9/11. Still affecting them, still affecting their brain, created new channels, new pathways that didn't exist before 9/11/01. So is peak experience a shock treatment of ecstasy? If peak experience is the positive equivalent of a trauma, then the equivalent of a post-traumatic stress disorder is what I call post-peak experience order. I know, cheesy, but I think there is something behind it. Some research on it, some very little, but I think it actually works. So one of the research studies that was done on it was by one of Maslow's students. She studied women after childbirth. And what she found was that sometimes, not always, in fact, not most times, but often, these women experienced a peak experience, and it changed their lives. As a result of it, they became more confident, more generous and benevolent, and happier, just as a result of a single experience. A shock treatment of ecstasy, something which happened to them, which meant so much to them. Now, they did this research in the early 50s or early 50s. Today, it may also happen more often with men, because men today are more likely to be present when the child is born. I know that when David was born, I burst out crying. It was a very powerful experience when it happened. Certainly a peak experience for me. Here is what Maslow says about peak experiences, and again, not talking explicitly about post-peak experience order, but alluding to it. Peak experiences often have consequences. They can do the same there as psychotherapy. If one keeps his goals right, and if one knows just what he is about, and if one is conscious of what he is going toward. We can certainly talk, on the one hand, of the breaking up of symptoms, like the breaking up of cliches, of anxieties, or the like. Or on the other hand, we can talk about the development of spontaneity, and of courage, and of Olympian or godlike humor and suchness, sensory awareness, body awareness, and the like. So what he's saying here is that these effects can have consequences beyond just the peak experience, if we do certain things, such as follow up on it. William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experiences, talks about such moments that change lives, and how they change lives. Peak experience can quite literally lead to a new brain order. And again, the jury's still out on the research, but there is more and more suggestions, and we'll talk about it next time as well, that show that there is something there. That it can be the positive equivalent of a trauma, if we know what we do to do with it. And here is the important issue. The question is, first, do we experience peak experiences, and how do we experience more of them? And second, after we experience peak experience, how can we make it more likely that we enjoy PPEO? Because just like not everyone after a trauma experiences PTSD, in fact, the majority don't, just in the same way, most people don't experience PPEO after a peak experience. How do you increase the likelihood, first, of increasing peak experience, and second, of increasing the likelihood of post-peak experience order? So to enhance peak experience, just very briefly, because essentially the course is about that. So I'm going to just throw out a few ideas that we've talked about, or some that we will talk about. First, permission to be human. Acceptance, accepting emotions. Why? Because if we don't accept painful emotions, if we don't give ourselves the permission to be human, we're blocking our emotional pathways. And positive emotions and painful emotions often flow through the same emotional pathways. And when we're limiting one, we're very often limiting the other. So if we open up the pathways, give ourselves the permission to be human, give ourselves the permission to cry when we're sad or ecstatic, that very often opens up, makes it more likely that we experience positive emotions as well. Paradoxical, but this is the paradox of the permission to be human. When we give ourselves the permission to experience painful emotions, we're more likely to experience the positive emotions. Mindfulness, being present. A lot of times when we're listening to music, for example, really listening to music, not just having it as a background while text messaging, doing homework, and talking to our friends. But when we really listen to music that we love, very often we have a peak experience, being present. According to Maslow's research, these are two of the most likely areas where we can experience the peak experience. And by the way, this, I believe, is innate. Even I see with Shirelle, my 1-year-old daughter, when there is music, when we dance, she laughs. This is not something we taught her. I think we were born with this inclination for music and dance. We need to take time for that. Having a meaningful goal, when we're on purpose, when we're doing things that we love to do, when we're doing is meaningful and significant to us, we're much more likely to experience peak experiences. Finally, one of the greatest barriers in our culture, time. It's very difficult to experience peak experiences when we're on the rush, when we're stressed and anxious. These are peak experience killers. Whether it's when making love, whether it's when listening to music, whether it's when spending time with friends, or all of the above together. How do we enhance the likelihood of PPEO? Once we've experienced peak experience. First thing, replaying and imagining. Remember, the mind doesn't know the difference between the imaginary and the real. It plays it over and over again. And when we play it over and over again, the neural pathway is reinforced. The sledgehammer begins the neural pathway, and then we reinforce it through replaying, through imagination. Writing about it. This is going to be your response paper next week. Writing about a peak experience. When we journal about it, describing it, not analyzing it. Remember the difference with Lyubomirsky. Positive emotions, positive experiences, it's not as helpful to analyze. So just to describe it, once again, reinforces the neural pathways. We relive it, we replay it. Once again, taking time. Taking time. And finally, taking action, which is how we can reinforce the initial experience of the peak experience. Reinforce the neural pathway. So I had an insight, an aha moment as a result of this peak experience. Now I'm going to do something about it and act, which leads me to the second point, which is behavior. I've been teaching and participating in workshops and seminars and classes on self-improvement, psychology, positive psychology, clinical psychology for almost 20 years. Before I was 20. And what I noticed in other people's workshops or in my workshops and seminars and classes is the following. Most people, if the workshop or the class is good, exit the classroom or the weekend or the semester, if they were here before, they usually experience a relative high after. But there are two groups of people. Both groups experience a relative high. The first group, which unfortunately are the majority, after that high, go back to their base level of happiness. Something we're familiar with. The second group, not the majority, but not a small minority, experience that high after. That high doesn't last forever. However, they go back, but when they go back, their base level of well-being is higher than it was before. And they continue to have their vicissitudes, but this time along a higher base level of happiness than before. Now, needless to say, I wanted to understand why people experience this, some people, and other people experience this, because I want people who take my class to enjoy lasting change, as opposed to temporary, nice, feels good, not enough. Doesn't justify the effort that they put into the workshop, and doesn't justify the effort that I put into my work. So I wanted to understand the difference between the two. And here is the single most important difference that I identified between these two groups. Group 2, the distinguishing characteristic was that after the workshop or class or seminar, not at the end of the semester if it was a semester-long class, after each class or after many of the classes, introducing immediate behavioral change. They don't wait and say, okay, after the course is over, I'll reevaluate my life and see how I do. Immediately introducing real behavioral change. Doing exercises that we talked about in class. Taking risks that they haven't before, but introducing change immediately. Not waiting. And those who introduce change immediately don't have a high or a peak experience constantly, but their base level of happiness goes up, as opposed to going down, returning to where it was before when there was no behavioral change. And now I start every workshop and seminar, when I have a few-day workshop or seminar, introducing this model of change. What we know from a lot of research in psychology is that there is a relationship between attitudes and behaviors. And we talked about it, we alluded to it already in the past. So we all have attitudes, whether it's attitudes about psychology, whether it's attitudes about another person, whether it's attitude about myself. And these attitudes affect our behavior. So for example, if I have a positive attitude towards psychology or positive psychology, I'm more likely to take 1504 than if my attitude towards psychology and positive psychology is negative. Or if I have a good attitude toward certain belief about a certain person, I'm much more likely to want to befriend this person if I like them than if I don't. So attitudes affect behavior. That's very clear, easy to understand. But what psychologists have found, the likes of Alice Eagley, Daryl Bem, and others, what they have found is that behavior also affects attitude. It works both ways. So if I behave in a certain way, it is likely to change my attitude in accordance with my behavior. And remember, we talked about it. Why? Because we have an attitude, and our behavior is the outside world. The mind doesn't like when there is incongruency between the inside and the outside. So if we behave a certain way, the attitude is going to be pulled down to reflect that behavior. If we behave in this way, the attitude, the mind doesn't like incongruency, it's going to create equality between the two, congruency, consistency between the two. And the way it will do that is either by changing our behavior, and here is the key, or more often by changing our attitude. Now, all of us here, whether you're 18 or whether you are 80, we all have habits. And again, we first make our habits, and then our habits make us. Habits are behavioral patterns, thinking patterns. Behaviors are more powerful, action is more powerful than words. If we have a certain behavior that we had before the class, what the class does is change your attitude about a certain thing. But if it doesn't match with your behavior, after the class, the mind looks for consistency, the attitude is going to be pulled down back to where it was before, unless your behavior changes to match your change of behavior. All a class can do, whether it's 1504 or Justice or Psych 1, all a class or a workshop, a seminar, all they can do is introduce attitudinal change. In this class, the attitudinal change is one, for example, self-esteem. What is self-esteem? The attitude that I have toward myself. High self-esteem, positive. Low self-esteem, negative. What is a benefit finder versus a fault finder? It's the attitude toward the world. Do I see it as positive, as a resource for well-being? or do I focus on the negative as a fault finder? Perfectionism. It's an attitude toward failure. But all this class can do, all I can do, all your TFs can do is introduce or encourage attitudinal changes to convince you through research that learn to focus on the positive. However, if you don't follow up with behavior, and that means doing the gratitude study, the gratitude exercise, that means writing the letter, your response paper for this week, but doing it regularly. Unless behavior is going to follow, the attitude will go back and reflect your attitude and your behavior from before the class or before the intervention. There has to be behavioral change. Let me show you some studies showing the impact of behavioral change. This was done prisoners of war in American prisoners of war during the Korean War. And what Edgar Schein, who's just across the street here at MIT, showed was that the captors of the Americans got them to change their mind about communism, about the Chinese captors. How? Gradually. By simply asking them, write about the good things within communism. We know you don't like communism. You wouldn't be fighting us if you did. But write about the positives of it. Write it to your prison mates. Write letters home telling them how you're being treated. And making sure, of course, that they only focus on the good. So they didn't ask them to lie necessarily, though often they did. But they asked them to focus on the positive. Over time, their attitude actually changed. And they became actually more open and more positive toward their captors. Because their behavior, writing letters, talking to their friends about it, they had to give lectures on it, was one of, I feel positive about this, and their attitude over time actually changed, and they became more positive. Cognitive dissonance, those who've taken Psych 1 or others heard about it. Cognitive dissonance is when there is incongruence between two thoughts, when two beliefs are conflicting. We don't like it, we want there to be a match. Or when there is a conflict between behavior and a belief. And what cognitive dissonance says is that this dis-ease has to be resolved. And the way we resolve it is usually by getting our attitudes, our thoughts, our beliefs to match our behavior. Again, behavior is more powerful than words. Self-perception theory, we talked about a lot. I'm not going to elaborate on it anymore. We see ourselves and we derive certain conclusions about ourselves. Facial feedback hypothesis. If you put on a frown now, or a nice gentle smile, your body chemistry is actually going to change to reflect whatever your face is showing. So this is a quote by, by Thich Nhat Hanh, difficult to pronounce his name, a Buddhist monk. Sometimes your joy is the source of your smile, but sometimes your smile can be the source of your joy. So we actually influence our body. We actually influence our mood through our face. That's why actors very often can get into whatever character they're playing simply by acting. Because there is the facial feedback to the rest of your body. You actually release chemicals according with the face that you're making. William James. Whistling to keep up courage is no mere figure of speech. On the other hand, sit all day in a moping posture, sigh and reply to everything with a dismal voice, and your melancholy lingers. Smooth the brow, brighten the eyes, contract the dorsal rather than the ventral aspect of the frame, and speak in a major key, pass the genial compliment, and your heart must be frigid indeed if it does not gradually thaw. What essentially William James is talking about is something beyond the facial feedback hypothesis. It's something where there is not much research, just a little research on, which is the body feedback hypothesis. If you sit down all day like this versus upright and proud, it will affect your mood. It will affect how you feel about yourselves in a few ways. First of all, the message you communicate to yourself, self-perception theory, but also in terms of how other people perceive you. If you shake hands like this, limply, versus shake hands firmly, you're communicating a message to the person with whom you're shaking your hand. And that message comes back right at you, both in terms of how they perceive you, and that impacts you, but also in terms of how you perceive yourself. You know, one of the ex-students from 1504, she played, she was on the hockey team, just graduated last year. So I met her over the summer, and she comes over and she shakes my hand, and I was in tears. It hurt so much. And I thought she must have listened in class. So don't exaggerate. Just firm, nice. I mean, really, I think she broke some of the bones in my hand. But it matters. It communicates a message. You know, I'm not going to mess with her, ever. I'm scared of her right now. It communicates a message of strength and confidence. If we walk around proud, we're communicating a certain message. If we're walking around stooped, we're also communicating a message to the environment that then reflects on us, but also to ourselves. And that reflects on us too. And finally, I want to share a study with you. This is by Hammerly. This is a study done. You know what? Actually, I'm going to leave that to next time because I want to get to something important. So I'm going to start next time with this study because it's a long study, but it's a very important study. So I will talk about it next time, first thing in class. I want to get to something before we end, something that will change our relationship. Fake it till you make it. David Myers has done a lot of important work in this area of positive psychology. And what he showed was that very often, even if we act happy, even if we act with high self-esteem, even if I act joyful, as William James said, that affects our mood. The question now becomes, what about permission to be human? Well, first of all, there are times when we don't want to fake it till we make it. We want to cry, we want to be miserable, and we want to act that way. However, we need to find when is it the time to get out and to go to that party, even if it's the last thing in the world that I want to do. And the difference here is about active acceptance. I can still accept my emotions, I can still accept my pain and experience it, and still choose to act in accordance with how I deem most appropriate or most helpful. So I can accept the fact, I was just dumped, say, by my girlfriend. I can accept the fact that I feel terrible about it and awful, but then 3 days later, go out to Noakes and party. Go wild. So, faking it, again, because of the facial feedback hypothesis, because of the body feedback hypothesis, because of self-perception theory, the behavior will affect my attitude. And after a crazy night out in Noakes, I will actually feel better. And healthy. Well, maybe not, but better. Get your head up. Walk up straight. When you watch Marva Collins, that's how she walks. That's how she carries herself, and that communicates a message to her students, to other people, to herself. I'm going to jump to this point. So very often behavioral change is gradual. So what is the acute change? The acute change is about coping. It's about putting ourselves on the line. And when we cope, the important thing, it's to take the risk. It's to do something that we don't feel comfortable doing. In other words, it's about exiting our comfort zone and entering our stretch zone. Now, what I want to do now is share with you two stories from my past. Two stories that initially will seem unconnected, but as you will understand soon, are very much connected. One a difficult story, the other a difficult story. My first memory. Now, most people have a first memory, the first time when, the first thing that you remember. My first memory is from September 1973. I was almost 3 years old, and it was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. And I remember being at home, and suddenly the phone rings. Now, the phone, my parents, Orthodox, I was raised Orthodox, the phone never rings on Shabbat, on a Saturday, let alone on Yom Kippur, but the phone rings. Both my parents, I remember them jump up and run to the phone. My dad picks it up, and I'm standing between my parents. He looks at my mom and says something, whispering. Couldn't hear what it was, but my mom's face changes. And there is terror, fear in her eyes. And I begin to tear. And my dad picks me up and says, I'm going for a few days, but I'll be back. Now I know what happened. So what happened was that my parents got a call from my uncle, who at that time was doing his reserves in the military. He's in intelligence. And war had just broke out. Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in Israel. The Israeli military most of the people are not on the borders, not protecting. It was a complete surprise. 5 Arab armies launch a war against Israel. My dad puts me down, goes to his room. From the top of I still see him taking out his army uniform, putting it on, taking his M16 submachine gun, putting it on, putting on his shoes, tying them. And my mom all the while with him, making him things. They're talking, once in a while smiling at me, but I sense a tension there. I don't know why. We then walk down to my dad's car, had a old turquoise Ford Cortina. He takes shoe polish and paints the lights of the car. Why? Again, later I know, because at night, when you drive with your lights on, you don't want the lights to be too bright in case of an air raid. So he paints the lights, and I watch him do all that. And then he picks me up and hugs me and says, once again, I'll be back in a few days. Gets into his car, and I begin to sob uncontrollably. One of our neighbors, whose name is Shalom, he's too old to go into the army, so he's standing there. We all look at my dad going off in the car, picks me up, and I'm crying. And he looks at me and says, Tal, do you want to be a soldier like Abba, like your dad, when you grow up? And I say, yes, I do. Well, soldiers don't cry. And I stopped crying. And I didn't cry for almost 20 years after that. And then I came to Harvard, and I started to study psychology. You know where I'm going, right? And I started to study psychology, and studying psychology, I realized that one of the things that I wanted to work on, one of the most important things that I wanted to work on, was getting in touch with my feminine side. You know, in Jung's language, yin and the yang, the anima and animus. I wanted to be more in touch with my feminine side because I knew that it wasn't healthy to repress emotions. I was repressing painful emotions. The exact same thing happens with positive emotions, same emotional channels. But I grew up in a culture that's very macho. Men don't cry. We're soldiers. We're tough. We can handle anything. And that's the culture that I grew up in. And again, this was my first memory. I heard the same thing over and over and over again. The same message. It's not cool. It's not manly to show emotions. It reminds me, after losing one of the most important squash tournaments for me, losing the national championships after I'd won it the year before. Surprise, wasn't supposed to lose it, was supposed to win. I go to my house with my girlfriend after, and we're just hanging out, and suddenly she begins to cry. And I say to her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "I'm crying because you're not crying." Because she understood how important it was for me. And this is how I basically experienced my childhood, teenage, being tough, being macho. And then I came here and I understood I need to let go. I need to be more in touch with the feminine side. So this is story number 1. Let me move on to story number 2. One of the students that I had here, some of you may know her, class of 04, was Lindsay Hyde. Lindsay Hyde studied with me. We had one-on-one tutorial as well. We worked a lot together. Lindsay Hyde is the founder of Strong Women, Strong Girls. Wonderful organization, part of PBHA. She founded it, now a national organization. I was also one of the founding board member of that organization. Wonderful stuff. swsg.org for those of you interested. And I was invited by Lindsay to give a talk for Strong Women, Strong Girls, for the mentors who were Harvard students, as well as students from women from other colleges around Boston. And I gave a talk, and here is Lindsay. Here she is with one of the students, third grade student, whom she mentors, and other Harvard students mentor, and do wonderful work. And I believe in this organization. I supported it from the get-go almost. And I gave a talk, and the talk was about teaching the importance of role modeling. It was about integrity. Talked to them about Marva Collins and about the important work that they were doing. And at the end of the talk, which went well, I think for myself, for the participants, I got a present, a gift, a token of appreciation. And the present was a shirt. It wasn't any shirt. It was a pink shirt, a color I don't normally wear. Certainly never wore it in Israel. Not only was it a pink shirt, it was, since it was a Strong Women, Strong Girls shirt, it was also a very small shirt, more suited for the third graders than for older ones. But still, they said, we want you to have it as a token of our appreciation. And then I made a mistake. And I said, jokingly, of course, was teaching 1504 at the time, I said jokingly, I will wear the shirt to class, and laughed. And here it is, the shirt that I got. And then there was another student of mine from 1504, Tori Martin, who ran the organization at that time, took over from Lindsay at Harvard. And Tori Martin said, I'm going to hold you to it. And I laughed and then almost cried. Because what do you mean hold me to it? I mean, I was joking. She said, look, you just talked to us about the importance of integrity, which I did. I mean, look here, integrity, it's even on behind. I did. And I said, that's right, I did. So what, am I going to go back on my word? That's one of my core values, integrity. And then my whole childhood flashed before my eyes. And I thought about something that Churchill said, which was, find opportunity in difficulty. So I looked for the opportunity, and here was an opportunity handed to me in a pink shirt to be more in touch with my feminine side. So ladies and gentlemen, in fact, maybe it was going out of my stretch zone a little bit, but into my panic zone. And I was telling the TFs before class that when I prepare for this class, and I have all my notes, here, and I write, every time I went over it, or when I initially wrote it on my notes, there was an adrenaline rush in my stomach, going out of my comfort zone. Now, I'm also out of my comfort zone, which is why I had to have it at the end of the class, as opposed to the beginning of class. But the key is to attain optimum levels of discomfort. I may have overshot a little bit, but the key is optimum levels of discomfort. And why? There is no other way to change. I can think about it all day long and say, I want to be in touch with my feminine side, or I want to be more courageous. I want to get up. I can think about it all day long. Nothing will happen. Nothing will happen unless we bring about real, actual behavioral change. Real, actual behavioral action. And when we do that, then the sky's the limit. Thank you. I will see you on Thursday.